Okay, is everybody able to see the slides here? Slide. Okay, so great to be here today. I see familiar faces, of course, and just glad to be here and presenting with my friend and colleague, Nell Compernolle. And our combined talk title is Alone Together, Older Adults, Social Context, Loneliness, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. So first, I'm just going to give a little bit of overall background for the two talks kind of connected together. So we're going to be talking about loneliness, and this is defined as a discrepancy between one's desired and actual level of social contact. And it's always good to note that this is a construct distinct from social isolation, which is more of an objectively minimal social contact. And this is a prevalent concern, especially among older adults. So we know that about a third of adults age 65 to 79 and about half of adults over age 80 reported frequently feeling lonely, and this is before the pandemic came around. And this is an important issue as well because it's well known to be associated with myriad poor health outcomes. So there's overall morbidity and mortality, and then many specific examples of outcomes like depressive symptoms, poor sleep, effects on physiological processes, and the list goes on. So another overarching focus of our presentation today is the effects of the pandemic. And maintaining social connections, of course, has been challenging due to COVID risk avoidance and social distancing guidelines. And we have seen studies showing that loneliness appears to have increased among older adults from before the pandemic to the first few months of the pandemic. So overarching question we're going to be talking about today is, what have older adults' social contacts actually looked like during the pandemic era, and how have they related to their experiences with loneliness? And we'll have two data sources and two papers to discuss today, and the first one uses data from NSHAP to look at how various modes of social contact relate to 5-year changes in loneliness and other measures of mental health. And the second paper will draw upon the chart data set, and this looks at how being alone and or at home at a given moment, so a different kind of time scale, might be differentially related to loneliness in the pandemic era versus before. So now I'm just going to jump into the first paper, Changes in Modes of Social Contact and Their Links with Mental Health During the Pandemic. And you can see my co-authors on this paper here, Drs. Hockley, Kotwal, and Waite. So it's well known that social relationships promote health and well-being. For example, they protect against loneliness and depression. And as I noted, older adults' mental health did worsen from before to early in the pandemic, and this extends beyond loneliness to other outcomes such as psychological distress and self-reported mental health problems. And this is a pattern that we're seeing not only in the US, but in other regions like the UK. And older adults have been encouraged to use remote modes of contact in lieu of in-person contact, in part because of their greater risk of severe complications related to COVID. But what do we know about how much this actually occurred and what effects that this had? And more specifically, we wanted to know, can increased remote social contact during the pandemic replace in-person contact to protect mental health? And we don't know much about this, but some preliminary evidence suggests not. So there's a study here that was among 33,000 Europeans, 50 and older, and they actually found that increased, electronic contacts in general through cell phone or video chat were actually linked with worsening depression, anxiety from 2016 to during the pandemic, whereas in-person contact was protective for these outcomes. So the aims of this investigation were first to characterize older adults' frequency of in-person and remote modes of social contact during the pandemic, and then how have these frequencies changed since the pandemic began. And then second, we wanted to assess the extent to which changes in older adults' mental health from 2015 to during the pandemic might be associated with these measures of contact. So were they associated with decreased in-person social contact? And were they associated at all with increased remote forms of contact since the pandemic began? And just in case there are one or two of you not familiar with the data set, I'll just say a little bit about it. So the NCHAP was designed to look at mechanisms through which social connectivity and health are intertwined in an aging population. So perfect data set for a question like this. And this is a nationally representative study of older adults, began in 2005 with data collection taking place about every 5 years. And the data collection began with in-home interviews among community dwelling adults. Their spouses and co-residing partners were enrolled in 2010. And then in 2015, a second cohort was also enrolled, including their partners and age-eligible household members. And the pandemic did shift some data collection in terms of mode, but we did get data at this time through a supplement, the COVID-19 subsidy. And this was fielded from September 2020 through January 2021. About 2,600 respondents from prior NCHAP waves participated remotely, and they often participated via web and paper and pencil, with a fewer number who participated via phone. And the results that I'm going to present today are among our analytic sample of about 2,500 of those respondents. And these were ones that were age 55 and up, who also had data from 2015. And this is because we wanted to look at that change in mental health over time. So getting into our measures, we first had this measure of their current social contact frequency during the pandemic. So since the start of the pandemic, during a typical week, how often have you had phone calls with family not living with you, from never to at least daily? And then we also asked about 3 other types or modes of social contact. And these included the domains of messages. Specifically, they were given these examples of emails, text, or social media messages. Then we had video calls like Zoom, FaceTime, or other platforms. And then, of course, the old-fashioned in-person visit. And of these 8 questions in total, they were asked 4 of them about family who were not living with them. And then 4 of the items asked about friends who were not living with them. And then immediately after those 8 questions, they were asked to reflect on how this was or was not a change for them. So compared to before the pandemic, would you say this is a lot more often, a little more often, the same, or some form of less often? And for our analysis, we did recode these to create dichotomous variables. And here we wanted to look at decreased in-person contact versus maintained or increased, and then increased remote contact versus maintained or decreased. So kind of mapping on with what we are interested in with social distancing guidelines. So moving on to our mental health measures. For happiness, we have this single item. If you were to consider your life in general these days, how happy or unhappy would you say you are on the whole? And this identical item was asked in 2015. For felt depression, we have another single item here from the CESD scale. In the past month, how often have you felt depressed? Again, the same item was asked in 2015. And then finally, we have the 3-item UCLA loneliness scale. During the past month, how often did you feel left out, feel isolated from others, And how often did you feel lonely? And for this scale, we followed the standard procedure to code the responses. So we combined never and hardly ever. And this resulted in a range of 3 to 9 for the total scale. Again, we have the same item from 2015, allowing for us to compare. So moving on to our analytic plan, we first did some descriptive statistics regarding their current contact frequencies during the pandemic, and then also their changes in these contact frequencies since the pandemic had begun. For our mental health links, we use linear regressions of each mental health outcome on changes in social contact modes with friends and family. So we had 3 different models where we put all these changes of contact in. And we had the decrease in person contact versus otherwise for friends and family, and the increased remote contact versus otherwise for friends and family. So these models adjusted for covariates, which included the survey mode for each respondent, and then demographics, specifically the gender, age, race of the respondent, whether they lived alone, their educational attainment, and then finally, we also included the level of the respective mental health outcome in 2015. And we did use throughout these survey weights from round 3. And I'll note before even going into the results that they were robust when we also repeated them using inverse probability weighting to just account for differences in demographics between the COVID substudy versus earlier participation. And the results were also the same when we adjusted for the respondents' current contact frequency, specifically whether it was regular, which we thought of as at least weekly, versus less often. So first of all, I'm just going to show the descriptive data for our analytic sample here. On average, the respondents were about 68 years old. A majority of the sample were women, non-Hispanic white, living with one or more others, and had an associate's or bachelor's degree or higher. And about half of the sample participated in the COVID sub-study via the web, with the other modes a little less frequently occurring. Okay, so now getting into aim 1 to figure out what their social lives are looking like here. So you can see the self-reported current contact frequencies during the pandemic by mode, where each mode is a different color and column. And this slide is only looking at contact with family. So first, at the bottom of the first column for in-person contact, we can see that 22% reported not having any in-person contact with their non-household family since the pandemic started. And keep in mind that by this time of data collection, this is about 6 to 8 months into the pandemic. So quite a sustained amount of time being physically isolated from these family, not living with them. However, 41% reported meeting their family in person less than once a week, and 37% were having at least weekly contact with these folks. Turning to the phone calls in red, 78% reported having phone calls with their non-household family at least once a week, and only 2% weren't having any phone calls with them. 69% were messaging with their non-household family once a week or more often. And on the rightmost column in blue, about 49% had not had any video calls with these family members, but it's interesting to look at the flip side and think half of them did, which I think is pretty cool. And 26% of them were actually having at least weekly video calls with family. So what are we seeing for friends? There's a parallel format slide for friends. And we're going to see some similar patterns here. So 25% on the bottom left had no in-person contact with non-household friends, but a combined 31% were having at least weekly in-person contact with them. Moving to phone calls, about 60% have had at least weekly phone calls with friends, and only 7% aren't having any phone calls with them. For messages, this is one of the more even distributions, but we still see that 64% combined have had at least weekly messages with friends. And then finally, 18% have had at least weekly video calls with friends, but 60% still hadn't had any at all. So now we're going to turn to changes in their contact frequencies. And first, we're just looking at family here. So in purple, in the middle for each bar, we can see that a majority of respondents reported they had not changed the frequency of contact with family outside of their household via each of these modes. And notably, 55% didn't report changing how often that they visited with family since the pandemic began, but 38% did report reducing their in-person contact, perhaps in response to the social distancing guidelines. And we do see in the blue sections that about 1 in 4 older adults did increase their family contact with each of these modes, remote modes. So what are we seeing for friends? And we do see a similar pattern emerging here. So for all 4 modes, a majority in purple don't report changing their contact frequencies during the pandemic compared to before. 54% report visiting with friends just as much during the pandemic as they did before. And then the percent in blue who say they've increased the remote modes is a little bit lower for friends, ranging from 16% for increased phone calls and 21% for messages. And then a couple of bonus slides here that break down the changes in contact and try and understand potential substitution effects in the modes that are being used. So specifically here, we're looking at just among the folks who said they decreased their in-person contact with family. What, if any, changes do we see for the other modes? And we see that about 31 to 37% report increasing their contact with family via the 3 remote modes. So a little bit more folks who are reporting increased remote modes for these folks compared to the overall sample from the prior slide. And here, looking at a parallel figure, but just among those who decreased in-person contact with friends, we see that 21 to 29% report increasing their remote contacts with friends, and increased messaging being the most commonly reported increase here. So next, let's turn to our next aim with mental health. And here we're going to first look at the regression for happiness. And this figure shows the value of the coefficients that are linking changes in in-person and remote contacts with happiness. And again, this also includes the covariates I mentioned earlier, but they are not included here just for parsimony of viewing. So the first 4 coefficients are for family and the bottom 4 are for friends. And we can see that decreased in-person contact with family during the pandemic was associated with less happiness during the pandemic relative to 2015. And there's a similar significant finding for decreased in-person contact with friends and less happiness. And then notably, we can see that in the presence of these in-person contact reductions, increases in these 3 remote forms of contacts with friends and family were not significantly associated with happiness. So what are we seeing for felt depression? We're actually seeing a similar pattern here. Decreased in-person family contact was marginally linked with more felt depression, and decreased in-person friend contact was significantly associated with more felt depression. And again, these increases in remote contacts with friends and family did not show a significant association in the presence of these in-person effects. And then finally, let's take a look at the loneliness model, where we're seeing a similar pattern again, but with an even more pronounced link between decreased in-person contacts with friends and family and greater loneliness. And something a little interesting here is that the coefficient size for the adverse effect of reduced friend impact is double the size of that for the reduced family contact effect. And similarly here, no significant links for the remote increases. So let's just take a step back to summarize here. Over half of the older adults had not reduced their in-person contact since the pandemic started. But it's unclear from these results so far why this is. It could be a lack or a low concern about COVID risk. It could be having weighed the pros and cons of this and really coming to value still that in-person contact. Or maybe they felt safe in a bubble with these non-household friends and family. More than 1 in 5 had no in-person contact with friends and family. And again, this is half a year or longer, 8 months for some folks of not seeing these people outside of their household. So that can be pretty isolating. However, 78% had at least weekly phone calls or messages with friends and family. And 40 to 51% had had some amount of video calls with friends or family, with 26% having at least those weekly video calls. So there is still some frequent connection via these remote modes that a lot of folks are experiencing. And the video calls can be pretty good news in terms of, just closing in on that tech gap for this population. And overall, only about a quarter reported increasing the remote forms of social contact with family. But this was a little bit higher for those who had decreased their in-person contact. So maybe they felt a little bit more of a need to shift where they're getting their contact from. Some things unknown here: did the respondent or the friends or the family initiate these increases, and why were they occurring? Were folks feeling down and seeking support, or were others more concerned for the respondent due to COVID risks or any other factors? And then in terms of mental health, older adults experience increases in loneliness and depression and reductions in happiness from 2015 to during the pandemic. So this is similar to some prior work. And this worsening mental health was associated with reductions in in-person contact since the pandemic began, perhaps especially for friends in terms of loneliness. And increased remote contacts did not significantly mitigate these links. And these results converge with some prior findings that in-person contact cannot be replaced by remote modes in maintaining mental health. Findings also show low rates of increased uptake of these remote contacts. So we don't know, did older adults lack access, ability, or interest in using these remote tech-mediated modes? Or could it be also maybe their social contacts made these assumptions about them, or their contacts were uninterested or didn't have access? And is there a greater frequency of remote contact that's needed to protect mental health that maybe on average folks were not meeting here, and that's why we didn't see a mitigation effect? Regardless of some of these unanswered questions, we can infer that adaptive strategies are needed to facilitate safe in-person contact for the millions of US older adults living with and experiencing adverse mental health effects from social isolation. And some strengths and limitations here: we did have retrospective reports of changes in contact since the pandemic began. We also had a few single item measures for happiness and felt depression. But we still have this great large nationally representative sample of US older adults with the same measures that were asked both in 2015 and during the pandemic, allowing for direct comparison. And these single item measures are ones that have been used in prior waves and prior research, and they also allowed us to minimize respondent burden for the COVID subsidy. And then finally, it's great to see that the pattern of findings here is robust to a number of different factors. Okay, so thanks for listening to part 1 here. And again, I'd like to thank my co-authors. Thanks for being here. And yeah, we'll come together later after the second paper for general discussion as well, but I
think maybe, Laura, if people have questions just about yours, just a few minutes for anything specific to yours right now. Fine. We have time. Anybody?
Hi, my name is Laura as well. It's a super exciting presentation. I'm actually studying a similar topic in our cohort of patients at the University of Chicago with David Meltzer's comprehensive care program. And one thing that I've also been thinking for myself, and as I was listening to your presentation, is you mentioned over half of the patients of older adults not having reduced in-person, had not reduced in-person contact since the pandemic. And I was wondering if you had looked at like any comorbidities where, you know, older adults that have any comorbidities may need a caregiver or have families that support them. Have you looked at that?
We haven't looked at comorbidity per se, but we did over the summer sometime look into, I think like ADLs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember exactly though what we found there, but it is, yeah, it's an important piece that some people didn't have an option to, to decrease some non-household if they needed that care or need to go to physical therapy or medical appointments and other routine folks that they see. Yeah.
Although, yeah, that would be outside of what we asked about, since we asked specifically about friends and family.
Yeah.
Not that they have no contact, it's just, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious.
Nell, is that a hand?
Am I allowed to ask a question?
About your own, yes.
I would love to ask, like, were you surprised that at the just descriptive statistics, even that, like, how many folks didn't decrease, you know, or didn't increase, you know, for the large majority of respondents didn't change much. And I don't know if you think it's because of the way the question was asked or what it was trying to assess, right? So maybe they still see family just as much, but it's a smaller group or something. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was surprised by the proportion who had not decreased, but in some ways, like a lower proportion who didn't increase their phone like that, I could see because so many are already like using that one a lot. The video, I think, was a little surprising to me. That's quite a few. And there could be some demographic differences in this. I was just taking a look this morning, not at the change, but like just current frequencies. And the men did have lower remote contact use, and as well as whites. And then the Hispanic and Black folks tended to use the remote modes more frequently. And I think the white folks were doing more in-person contact. So yeah, there's a bunch of subgroup differences there as well, perhaps.
The one thing that I think we don't have data on, which could play a big part in this, is they're seeing these people, but they're masking. They are authentically, you know, using all the safety precautions and carrying on. And that too might be differential among the groups, whether they're using masks, but that could explain safety and the interest in maintaining in-person contact. I think, Colm, you were next with a question.
So you made a good point, I think, early on, Laura, about the difficulty of judging what an increase means, and in particular, whether an increase in some of the other modes might be a sign of depression or loneliness rather than a result. So that it does seem to me that this is something which really could work quite easily in both directions. We all know that there are times, I guess, well, maybe not, some people might never be miserable, but if you're miserable, you might well reach out to people more because, you know, you really need someone to talk to. So it would appear that it's not mitigating what's happening, but it may well be mitigating it. So it's more a concern with the statement about directionality rather than anything else. there do seem to be two reasons for reaching out more. One is you like it because you want to talk to people. The other is you're desperate. So you're really hounding other people. You know, you're pestering them because you need to talk to someone. You need to have someone tell you something. And this seems to me to be a challenge in just in interpretation. You know, that all of these are conditional on what's happening. And a lot of them are conditional on loneliness or depression. And that makes it tricky to ascribe direction to lack of mitigation. We don't know that, in fact, it may well have mitigated depression and loneliness for everybody, because the people who reached out more and had more contact were people who would have otherwise been even more miserable.
Yeah, one of the ways it wouldn't be adequate, but it would begin to address that, is just take where they were in 2015 and stratify them. Those people who were already really lonely in 2015, were they more vulnerable during COVID and more desperate, as you say, as opposed to those who weren't lonely?
Yeah,
But
I agree. That's a good start. But of
in
course,
the interim.
yeah, I mean, it could be that you know, the reason they've increased is because they became miserable or lonely since 2020.
Exactly.
And I think that's a really interesting question. But I think I'm just a little concerned that the tone of the conclusions doesn't allow for this, and it says it's not mitigated by these things. And really, we don't know that. We're saying that because we don't know what the counterfactual is in those cases, and I think that's a critical issue in terms of saying, should people do this more? I mean, there's almost a prescriptive element in saying that doesn't help much, rather than a descriptive element which says we don't know which direction it's going in. And that would be a really interesting thing to study, either, you know, a follow-up study, a qualitative study, I mean, interviews with people, or some other measure of trying to get at that. So I think the results are fascinating, but I do think it's important to be careful about how we conclude that. For in-person loss of contact, that's something that was kind of dictated to people in many ways. I mean, that wasn't a voluntary thing, whereas the other things are, to a much greater extent, voluntary, and therefore their meaning is a little more complex.
Yeah.
Last question. If you're talking, I can't hear you.
You're not after me, Louise, are you?
There you are.
Okay, so I didn't hear you speak my name, so sorry.
Oh,
What I
okay.
was thinking was that Laura's comment, Laura Magda, points to more work that could be done, which would be to try to understand who the people were who decreased contact and who the people were who didn't decrease contact, whether they already had quite a bit, were the few people who were still working, or people who were providing care, or they just wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the one, some of you were here the other day, but others not. But yeah, one of the things that we're seeing that's linked with contact is their round 3 resilience. And it's not so much related to change in contact, but it is associated with their current contact a bit. So more resilient folks seem to be having more frequent contact with a bunch of these modes with folks.
I think the other thing you could do, which builds on the strength of NCHAP, is to look at the people who did suffer or not suffer, what their trajectories were. So did people of that age between 2010 and 2015 decrease in or increase in loneliness, isolation, and so on, or not, right? We know in the absence of the pandemic what happens to people in that age range when they go through a 5-year period or a 4-year period. And you could use that to calibrate whether it's related to Linda's point by identifying who are the people to whom this happened, and what did people like that have as a trajectory between 2010 and 2015.
Yeah.
If I could just add like something really quick too, based off the data that I've been working on so far, and this is like a cohort of patients that have been hospitalized more than twice in the last 2 years. So these are vulnerable patients that I'm actually looking at with higher hospitalization rates. And so far, I'm finding some insignificant patterns of those older adults actually having more social support, during COVID, which I thought was really interesting. So again, it's just preliminary things that I'm looking at right now, but it's definitely really interesting. It's very complex.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. In fact, I saw something very similar in a study out of Scandinavia where they saw increased social support for older adults. Nell, you're getting your slides ready. Thank you, Laura. Onwards.
Thanks, everybody.
Without further ado, thank you so much, Laura. That was awesome and a tough act to follow, but I'll try. I love the way that these two papers came together, to be honest, because I feel like Laura and colleagues' paper set this really wonderful context for what did it look like, kind of big picture, kind of bigger trends in this paper, and kind of getting to your comment poem as like, you know, what does it look like kind of in the everyday, day-to-day experiences, and kind of actually even more minute to the actual moments. And so some helpful reviewers helped us extend the title, but it's quite detailed. So today I'm presenting a study with colleagues Laura, Louise of NORC, of course, and Kate Cagney now of Michigan, entitled Home Alone Together, Differential Links Between Momentary Contexts and Real-Time Loneliness Among Older Adults from Chicago During versus Before the COVID-19 Pandemic. And just as Laura noted earlier, I won't spend too much time on this, but this study does kind of zero in on one of the dimensions of mental health that her study focused on, and that is loneliness. And as she noted, it's distinct from social isolation and has been linked to a number of adverse health outcomes, including morbidity, mortality. Some of the studies she's noted, but a lot of studies up until now have identified key risk factors for who might be at greater risk of experiencing loneliness. And that includes gender or women, living arrangements, those who live alone, as well as age. They've identified this sort of U-shaped curve or relationship with loneliness, with it really increasing in later adulthood around late 70s and on. And as she noted as well, a recent study or preliminary work suggests that older adults experienced increased or heightened loneliness with the advent of the pandemic in early 2020 or in 2020. Importantly, most of the existing studies conceptualize loneliness as trait-like, not trait-like, using, for instance, the 3-item loneliness, UCLA loneliness score. So asking, how often do you feel lonely? Did you feel lonely over a certain period of time? So for instance, over the past month. But this likely, and this really has helped us understand, trends in loneliness, but it really likely misses more minute experiences or fluctuations in loneliness related to everyday experiences. And again, as Laura noted, a lot of these day-to-day experiences were fundamentally different during the pandemic due to pandemic-related guidelines, for instance, social distancing, physical distancing. Lots of establishments were not open, and so the availability of certain activities were no longer available. So Laura, actually the co-authors on the present study, Laura, Louise, and Kate, we have a study doing just this. We use momentary assessments of loneliness, trying to understand key factors that may be shaping older adults' momentary loneliness. And we identified 2 important loneliness-inducing real-time experiences, specifically when older adults are at home and when older adults are alone. They were found to really consistently report greater intensity momentary loneliness. So kind of linking these 2 sets of literatures, there's some gap that remains unclear, and that is how, if at all, have these loneliness-inducing contexts affected loneliness differently during the pandemic versus before. So to be clear, there's very little, if at all, when we started writing this paper, no known research on this topic. We don't know a lot about it. But there are reasons to think that these loneliness-inducing contexts might have been less adversely experienced by older adults during the pandemic. And one is that the usually protective effects of being outside the house versus being at home, they're likely diminished during the pandemic. And that is really, as I noted, because being outside the home was qualitatively different. There were fewer places to visit. Everybody was masked. Everybody likely stood apart. I remember going for runs and you had to leave the sidewalk. So you weren't close to people. So you just didn't interact. And so the benefits of being outside the home and socially engaged were likely smaller. At the same time, there seemed to have been this normative shift during the pandemic in which certain loneliness-inducing experiences like being alone and being home may have been normalized, less stigmatized because of these guidelines and because they were kind of shared experiences in which that a lot of people were really experiencing at the same time. So this leads to a number of hypotheses that we test in this paper. During versus before the pandemic, we expect older adults to have experienced more intense or greater intensity momentary loneliness. We also expect older adults to have been more likely to be momentarily at home as well as alone during the pandemic. And last, we expect older adults to have experienced being momentarily at home and alone, So again, the loneliness-inducing contexts less adversely during the pandemic. So, and I am a presenter. I love interacting. So if anybody has questions, raise their hand about the chart study. This is also housed at NORC with Kate Cagney, now at Michigan, but we're kind of presenting the first results from a new wave of data, new waves of data. So the chart study is funded it's an R01 with Kate Cagney, led by Kate Cagney. And it was really designed to describe the social and spatial environments in which older adults spend their time. And using that to kind of understand how these activity spaces or environment relate to changes in older adults over time. There's 6 waves of data spanning roughly 2.5 years in kind of 2 buckets. Kind of the first bucket is the main data collection that occurred pre-pandemic, again in 3 waves, spaced roughly 6 months apart, starting in April 2018 and concluding in November 2019. With the second bucket occurring during the pandemic. And this was also 3 waves, but these were spaced 1 month apart. And data were collected between June and September of 2020. Chart in general, the study is a population-based cluster sample of 450 adults ages 65 and older at baseline. And these adults reside in 10 neighborhoods that were purposely selected across Chicago to capture the racial and ethnic and socioeconomic variation across these areas. From this main sample in 2018 and 2019, there was the subsample during COVID. It included 125 respondents, and they really were representative, or not representative, but equally distributed across these 10 neighborhoods with at least 10 respondents from each of these 10 neighborhoods. Again, totaling 125 respondents. So the methods, there were 6 waves of data collection, but there were baseline interviews in each of the first 4 waves. So the 3 main waves in the beginning of the COVID data collection period. After each of these interviews, respondents were given a smartphone and provided some instruction on how to use it. And this smartphone was equipped with an app. And the idea was that 5 times per day, the app sent them pings or triggers in the form of a text during 5 windows of time, randomized in each of these times. And each of the windows were about 2.5 hours and starting at 8 a.m. and ending at 8 p.m. And the idea is that each of these pings then would prompt respondents with very few items, but to ask about their momentary experiences. And so at the end, we really have a nice collection or a random sample of older adults' daily lives and their experiences. We followed the literature on EMAs. It's really an emerging literature on EMAs, and excluded from analysis all EMAs that we deemed to be invalid. And so we kept those that were responded to within 30 minutes of a trigger or a ping, And we included only those that took fewer than 30 minutes to submit or complete. Again, we're interested really just in those EMAs that provide a snapshot of their momentary experiences in a window that we are interested in. We also exclude from analyses EMAs that were submitted within 30 minutes of each other, based on the assumption that they aren't really providing new information, if they really were happening or submitted, very close together. This resulted in a working sample of 110 respondents who completed a total of 13,422 EMAs. And importantly, these respondents submitted at least one EMA pre and during COVID, but in reality, it's much greater than that. They submitted an average of 122 EMAs per respondent, and the median, I think, was 140. So we're really talking about most respondents submitted a good amount. So again, in contrast to this kind of trait-like loneliness, we use an item that really asks about their momentary loneliness. So respondents were prompted, think about how you felt at the time you were pinged. Did you feel lonely? And the response items went from 1 to 4, from not at all to very. And they were also prompted to report their momentary physical context. And we dichotomized that into an indicator of whether they were at home or not. When they were not at home, that included places like at work, in transit. I'm trying to think where else. At a friend's house, I think, but we collapsed those. And so they were also prompted to report on their momentary social context. And we again created a dichotomous measure indicating whether the respondent was alone. If they were not alone, they could report who they were with. And that included their spouse or partner, a family, a friend, or neighbor. Our last major EMA measure is just an indicator measure indicating whether the EMA was submitted during the pandemic, and that just used the EMA paradata. We also control for a number of key covariates that have been linked with loneliness. And in the baseline interview, just that first interview before wave 1, respondents self-reported their gender, their race and ethnicity, their educational attainment, and their age. And then at every wave, again, waves 1 through 4, they were asked to report their marital status, their employment status, and their physical health status. We leveraged these rich panel data, multiple assessments across individuals, again, across about 2.5 years, and use multi-level regression models with the EMAs nested within individual respondents. And we use linear regressions to address research questions, trying to predict loneliness intensity. So that's research questions 1, trying to understand the association between the pandemic and loneliness, as well as research question 3, to understand whether specific contexts were less adversely experienced during the pandemic. And we use logistic regression models for models that are trying to predict the likelihood of experience particular loneliness-inducing contexts. So what are the results? Again, loneliness, the response options range from 1 to 4. And looking at all 13 or 14,000 EMAs, respondents reported a mean loneliness of 1.23. So that's really between not at all and slightly, skewed really kind of towards the better mental health. That said, it's really important to note that 75% or 3/4 of respondents reported some loneliness at some point throughout the observation period. In fact, nearly 1/5 of respondents reported being very lonely, so the greatest intensity at some point. And I think it's also worth noted that no respondents reported some level of loneliness in all EMAs that they submitted. And so really what we have are, yes, it's skewed, but we have a wonderful kind of sample of EMAs, or representative sample of these moments of older adults in which their loneliness intensity fluctuates over time. I won't spend too much time. I hope this isn't super small, but just some sample statistics we can revisit if you're curious. It was slight majority women, 57%. There were 44% of the sample was non-Hispanic white as well as non-Hispanic Black, with 13% of the sample reporting as non-Black Hispanic. A large majority, 67%, had attained at least some college, and the mean age at baseline was about 72 years old. Looking at these health statuses that vary over time and collected or assessed at each of the beginning of waves 1 through 4, pre-COVID respondents reported being in relatively good health, but this changed during COVID to worsened health. The marital status remained largely unchanged, with about a third of the sample reported being married or living with their partner. And employment status was also remained largely unchanged, with between a fifth and a fourth reported any employment. So this includes kind of part-time or part-time or full-time. Moving to the EMA level, again, this is about 13,000 EMAs. We find that loneliness did, on average, change, was different pre versus during COVID, with a mean loneliness score of 1.19 pre-COVID and 1.24 during COVID. Interestingly, respondents did not leave the house as often, or at least the EMA submitted, nearly 4/5 of EMAs submitted during COVID were at home, compared to 70% pre-COVID. And also interestingly, and kind of similar to what Laura presented, they were not more or less likely to be alone than they were pre-COVID. And, it's possible that they were just hunkering down with a select few, but they were not significantly more or less likely. Megan, yeah, I see you have a raised hand.
Sorry, I was like lowering my hand and unmuting at the same time. First of all, this is super exciting and great work. And every time I hear more about CHART, I'm really, really excited about it. A couple quick questions for you. The pre-COVID waves were 6 months apart, and the post-COVID waves were every month, basically. So I'm just wondering how comparable the averages pre-COVID were to after COVID, when there's so much time difference between them. They're covering years, potentially, rather than just a few months. So what about that? And then my second question is the statistical significance difference in loneliness there. How clinically relevant is that? I'm not that comfortable or knowledgeable about that loneliness scale ranging from 1 to 4.
I think that these are fantastic questions. And so first, I think these are great questions. So you are right. Waves 1 through 3 were 6 months apart, and COVID were 1 month apart. I think that there's two important things. And one is, I just have to say that we did run robustness checks, including only EMAs submitted during the same months or time of year as the COVID waves, just to check for like seasonality and stuff like that. And I think like a better answer to that question is, and it really doesn't matter how we model it exactly, what we seem to be finding is like, they really properly are moments. And so like the fact of whether we are comparing a moment 6 months ago or a moment 1 month ago, they really are this just kind of collection of older adults' moments in which they live. So I think the biggest distinction really is pre versus post. But even still, if we just collapse it to look at like wave 3, for example, versus COVID waves, which is more or less the same period of data collection, the results are the same. Does that make sense? I can't see you.
Sorry, I was holding up my thumb. Yes, thank you. That's extremely helpful.
And I think your other comment is also extraordinarily important. And the biggest thing here is, you are right. We are talking about a skewed measure, and we are talking about really, really small changes. And the way we understand it is that these small changes add up to be more substantial over time. So they can accumulate so that these greater intensity moments of, somebody who reports feeling very lonely more often it's likely something that we might want to intervene on for those moments, right? I think on the whole, in the variation, I have this more descriptive statistics. So for instance, like respondents were significantly more likely to have reported that very much during COVID versus before. And so it looks like a small one, but the fluctuations are larger during COVID versus before. But you are right, we're talking about a very small difference on a scale of 1 to 4.
That is super helpful, and it just made me think about a study we were doing with accelerometry variance. In some ways, accelerometry is like momentary analysis too. And we saw big differences in the activity variance, across the day for frail adults versus non-frail adults. I'm just curious if you actually see bigger differences in the variance rather than just the means here.
Yes, and we do. I wish I had prepared that, but we do. There's just a lot more moving up and down during COVID.
I think that's really interesting.
Your momentary.
You do kind of see that in the standard deviation if you want to infer.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, for sure.
Correct. Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Those are oopsie daisy. There we go. All right. Okay. So moving on to kind of the multivariate analyses. Again, this is a multi-level linear regression. Ordered logits have the same results. And so first and foremost, just looking again at this dichotomous measure of whether the EMA was submitted during COVID versus before, and they report significantly greater intensity loneliness during COVID versus before. And again, Megan, this is spot on with your comment. I can't get rid of that, and I'm sorry. This is exactly what you were saying. It's substantively small, but over the course of 13,000 EMAs likely adds up. And then this replicates our findings from our previous study, and that is that being momentarily at home and momentarily alone also increases heightened loneliness, momentary loneliness. So then the second question, are they more or less likely to experience these loneliness-inducing contexts during COVID versus before? And this first model reports results on predicting their likelihood of being home. And as you can see here, consistent with bivariate statistics, they were significantly more likely to be home during COVID versus before. And again, similar to bivariate statistics, they are not more or less likely to be alone during COVID versus before. So what does it mean when we combine these two? Kind of moving on to our research question 3, do older adults experience these loneliness-inducing contexts differently during COVID versus before? And starting with the experience of being at home, you can see the main effect of being during COVID, again, positive, more lonely. Also at home, main effect of being home, more lonely. But this interaction is negative, suggesting that older adults who are at home during COVID not adults, this is a multi-level model. So they were less lonely at home during COVID than they were at home pre-COVID. And the same can be said for when they were alone. So they were less lonely when they were alone during COVID than they were when they were alone pre-COVID. Interactions, I think, are really awesome, but I think they can be hard to interpret. And so we moved to do this visually to illustrate what these look like. And so we combine home and alone in like a 2x2 cell, a categorical measure, with home and alone as the reference. And so we kind of combine each of these two measures and all of the possible combinations. Home and alone is the reference group, with other momentary contexts, including home and not alone, not home and alone, and not home, not alone. And it's kind of funky, but I'll try and walk us through it. Looking first at these blue bars, these are the average marginal effects of being in specific momentary contexts versus being home and alone pre-pandemic. So the biggest takeaway here is that pre-pandemic, compared to being home and alone, each of these contexts results in less intense loneliness in the moment. And it doesn't matter what combination, it's all beneficial. During COVID, compared to pre-COVID, it's a different story. In each of these contexts, again, compared to being home and alone, there's less benefit here during COVID. And this is really across all three momentary contexts. The most striking is really being not home and alone. And so that is really telling, and that is that when older adults are outside the home and alone, so if you're just walking around or maybe going to the grocery store, you are not any less lonely during COVID than you were at home and alone. So there is no actual protective effect or benefit from being outside the home during COVID. And there was pre-COVID, if that makes sense. Any questions? I think interactions can be tricky.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little more about that last point again. So clearly that's an important difference in that you're pointing to there. And you tended to suggest it negatively, right? But it seems to me you could, but I may be wrong, describe it as saying getting out the house makes more difference to you during the pandemic than it does pre-pandemic relative to being home and alone, right?
So this is pre-pandemic. And so
it's really bad for you to be alone, not in the home, right? During.
Well, remember, negative is good here because you're less intense lonely.
Yeah, are you really not lonely at all? I mean, you're the same as you would be, right? Just being alone,
Correct.
but not in the home is nearly as good as being at home and not alone, right? That's your reference category.
Home and alone.
Home and alone.
Okay, so there's no difference there. But there is
Correct.
a difference.
And
There was
so
a difference.
Exactly.
Just explain to me what that tells you.
So if you're compared to being home and alone, there is no benefit. There is no benefit with regard to your loneliness when you're outside the home and alone during COVID. But there is pre-COVID because you're likely socially engaged. Maybe you're talking to the cashier or you're running into people at the dog park. But there is no benefit during COVID when you're outside the home and alone.
Makes sense.
And it's, there is a benefit when you're not home and not alone because you're talking to your spouse or you're out with your neighbor Nancy and she's in your bubble and you can reap those benefits maybe. But if you're alone, you're really not interacting with them. There really is you don't reap the benefits of being outside the home if you're alone.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'll have to think about it, but thank you.
I mean, I had to take another stab at explaining this result when we revised and resubmitted, because I think the first take on it was not very clear. And so, yeah, I'm happy to talk through anymore. I think it is and I think what's interesting is I wasn't sure how to present it even here, but these two are are outside the home. And it just varies on your social accompaniment, your social context. And even here, you are not home and not alone. Just the effects of being not home are just not as great. So your social context matters, but it's really your physical context that is really markedly different pre versus during.
So you could think the not at home, not alone, maybe you were going out with friends and now you and your spouse are out at the grocery store. So you're with somebody, but it's not the same group of people. You're not going to church. You're not going to bars. You're not going to the golf course and schmoozing with people. You're with one other person who you're with all the time.
All the time.
Okay, I guess I was thrown partly by the fact that negatives here are positive.
Right.
I think that might be part of the complexity is a drop in loneliness a decrease is equivalent to a positive effect. And I think That's kind of
Correct.
counterintuitive in a way, I mean, in terms of describing it.
No, I have this. We plot the opposite here, and this is really just with a different reference group. This reference group is not home, not alone. So like the most protective or beneficial context. So
Right.
when you choose the reference group, it's a little bit more intuitive to be like, oh, so being not home and not alone, there's no benefit.
Right.
There's
Yeah,
no
I
benefit.
think
There's
that's-
no difference.
For me, that would be much clearer, just because it's, we think of positive as being good and negative as being bad. So a negative is a positive, but it doesn't feel that way. I mean, it's just not there. I think it seems to me much easier to make a sentence that describes what's happening. So if you have a choice, I would be inclined to go with that presentation, because it says, this is the amount of benefit you get from these changes, right? And here you get no benefit from being home and not alone, right? In the other one, you do get a benefit, and that says the benefit goes away during the pandemic. Whereas to say the negative effect goes away is the negative change, which is a positive change in your mood, goes away, right? Is, I think, much harder to grasp for people who just who haven't thought it through and are not. Don't keep making this transfer from negative to positive. I think it's true of nearly all the loneliness presentations, that it's really important to think about whether you're describing something positive or negative. So if you say there's a decrease in loneliness, that's I don't know. I feel just looking at this, I would have found this much clearer. They're obviously identical in terms of the meaning, right? But it's a question of which will communicate better.
No, very well received, Colm. And we actually ended up presenting both in our previous paper. And Alyssa is presenting another paper on loneliness using these data, and she's doing both too. So thank you for that.
Well, clearly a case where you can do a controlled experiment, give say 200 for enough power, give 200 presentations, some with both, some with in different orders, and some with only one.
I'll present. That's next quarter.
Yeah, and do an assessment of the results, classified by the age and obstinacy of the people who are asking the questions. And I think you'd have a very interesting paper.
Nobody'd read it.
Stay tuned.
But I think what's advantageous here, Nell, is that the contrast or comparisons you want to make aren't affected. In some instances, it might matter which are the interesting comparisons you want to make. But I think it would work well in this case, as you've shown.
Summary of results, and we can kind of move to synthesizing the two, big picture. So research question 1, older adults we found were more likely to experience any loneliness, just in descriptive statistics, as well as greater intensity loneliness during the pandemic versus before. And as expected and consistent with previous studies, being momentarily alone and at home both induced loneliness. Older adults were more likely to be at home, but not alone during the pandemic versus before. And they also experienced these loneliness-inducing contexts less adversely. Conversely, they experienced the benefits. They were less protective or kind of not as beneficial during the pandemic. Just to wrap it up, what we can tell is really one of the first studies to examine real-time context and momentary loneliness during the pandemic. And Megan, as you noted, the effect sizes are small, but they can accumulate over time to have real meaning. The likelihood of being at home, the fact that it was so stark, really suggests that older adults did adhere to these public health guidelines and stay home, and probably bubbled. And they were just as kind of like Laura, what you found. They're not more or less likely to be alone during the pandemic. And of course, they experience these associations differerly, which we speculate might be due to the fact that being home or alone was less stigmatizing because we were all doing it, and or being outside the home. I think this is a really particularly noteworthy finding that just provided less social interaction or less engagement. Limitations, of course, the studies focused on Chicago. We don't really know how these would hold in more rural areas. And it's also, the sample is comprised of individuals who have some experience or comfortability with smartphone or smart devices. Future directions, we'd love to look at race and ethnic differences and how they might have experienced each of these 3 research questions, their likelihoods in experiencing some of these contexts and such. Laura, did you want to take it from here?
Yeah, help me. Oh, hold on. I gotta jump back in here to my screen. Right. Okay. So concluding thoughts. So we can see from NCHAP that there seems to be something uniquely beneficial about in-person social contact for mental health that perhaps remote contacts can't replace. And from the chart data, being home and or alone doesn't seem to be as lonely of an experience during the pandemic as it was before. So some amount of in-person contact is characteristically important, but it remains very possible to be momentarily content being at home and or alone, perhaps increasingly as time goes on. So some lingering questions or potential next steps. Is there a certain frequency of remote social contact that's needed to meaningfully benefit mental health? Is there a minimal amount of in-person contact that suffices for folks? And then how might desired levels of each of these domains of contacts be shifting over time? So also, will these shifts, if there's a preference, or being okay with less frequent in-person contact during the pandemic, is that something that could stick around for a while, even after the pandemic is over? And then an idea that we started to talk about is, did those who had greater social connectivity before the pandemic perhaps have more to lose during the pandemic? So we could think about, for example, social network size, or like a overall social engagement measure from round 3 of NCHAP before the pandemic. Is that kind of like a moderator of having lower in-person contact with reduced mental health? So if you're really accustomed to having those connections 5 years ago, could you have, further to fall, so to speak? And that's something that we could look at with both these 2 data sets at different time scales again. And why are older adults less lonely when home or alone now? Objective possibility is that maybe there's just, because of these fewer events going on, there's less FOMO, and Jane is out at this party and I'm here alone. No, we're all alone here at this point, end of 2020. And then, yeah, just it's a nice kind of idea, this idea of changing norms and not being the only one who's alone. So having drawing some strength from being alone together with others.
Nice wrap, bringing it back together to the title, Alone.
Yeah.
Any more questions?